Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome to a new semester of Encounter Small Groups. Super excited to do Genesis 1 through 11 this semester. You might remember a few years ago we did Genesis 12 to 33. Honestly, at the time, I was new to being the small group pastor, and the story just gets a lot simpler in Genesis chapter 12, to be honest, and follows Abraham's life. At the time, I didn't really want to tackle creation in 1 through 11. But you know what? I don't really care that much anymore. I think it's going to be great. So Genesis 1 through 11 actually is my favorite scripture, favorite part of the whole Bible. I came across this podcast probably 5-6 years ago called the Babel podcast with Marty Solomon that completely changed the way that I saw these first 11 chapters. I'll definitely be using some of their content in the development of this material for this semester, but that won't be my only source. I'm also going to lean on Dr. Bruce Waltke's commentary on the book of Genesis, as well as his work in an Old Testament theology. And Dr. Bruce Waltke, he's an absolute legend. Okay, I watched an Old Testament class that he does on Theos University a while back, and he's this 90-year-old man, and he stood for his entire class that he taught, each one like an hour long. And he's standing there and, he introduces himself. And before he gets into the material, he was like, let's pause for a word of prayer. Just picture this 90-year-old giant in the faith praying for the people that are going to watch this video. But anyways, he was just an incredible guy. If you've never heard of him, definitely check out some of his material. But along with Bema, the podcast, and Dr. Waltke, I'll obviously let the Lord guide me personally during my reading and studying too. So, since this part of the Bible is so old, it's important to establish some viewpoints before we even start reading. That's why this week we aren't covering any scripture. It's purely an introduction to the text. And the first place to start is to ask, what is the context of Genesis 1 through 11 when it was first written? We know from references in scripture that Moses is credited as the author. He is believed to have written the entire Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. This is referenced in Torah itself, throughout the Old Testament history books, and by Jesus in the New Testament. It's possible that parts of the Torah were slightly edited or added onto during the exilic period of the Old Testament for clarity's sake, but that doesn't discredit Moses as the genuine author. Now, we know that Moses was not born until well after the events of Genesis 1 through 11, so how is he able to write down all these events? Well, God helped him, right? God played a part in that. They're divinely inspired. But these stories were likely passed down orally since the time of Adam and Eve, and then they passed them down to their kids all the way to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and on down to Moses. And so Moses has this supernatural insight through the power of God himself, but he has this oral history of stories to draw from. And some of you might be skeptical of this, but Moses also knew origin stories from the Egyptians, from the Mesopotamian people. There were pagan civilizations at the time that had similar origin stories that actually predate the writing of Genesis. And so some of his inspiration likely came from some of these stories as well, really to give the true and the God-given version of them. This doesn't mean that Genesis isn't real or accurate or that it's stolen material, as the content in Genesis does have the major difference of having a monotheistic creator God versus the creation stories from these other civilizations that have many gods. So Genesis may share a few similarities from these pagan stories, but its theology is much, much different. So Moses, being divinely inspired, writes Genesis. What is the setting and context of him penning this book? This is really important for our understanding. It's right after the Exodus, when the Israelites are camped in the wilderness at the base of Mount Sinai. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt for 430 years. That comes from Exodus 12:40. And in Egypt, we know one of their tasks, day after day, was to make bricks. So their entire identity for all of those years was built around what they were able to produce for the Egyptians. The more bricks you can make, the better slave you were and the more valuable you were. But now here they are out in the wilderness, miraculously freed by the power of God through the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, and called to be God's chosen people. But God needed to teach them about their history, about who he was, about how they should relate to him. Sure, maybe they had heard stories about their ancestors, but this didn't need to be word of mouth anymore. It needed to come directly from God to his people. So at its core, this is what Genesis 1 through 11 is about. It is an origin story for all of creation and mankind. It's meant to teach us about who our God is, how our relationship with him was broken, and glimpses of how it will be restored. So that's the context. Moses writing in the wilderness to the Israelites during the time after the Exodus about their origin story. God really wanting to teach them about who he was, about himself. Next, we need to introduce a theological word, hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the branch of knowledge that deals with the interpretation of the Bible. We all read the Bible with a certain hermeneutic, whether we realize it or not. And oftentimes we approach the Bible while thinking about the context of our world in 2025, when the world of the Bible was very different. We need to view Scripture with a proper lens. And this is especially important with Genesis 1 through 11 because of the style of writing that it encompasses. It is not a straightforward narrative. If you skip to chapter 12, Genesis, and the call of Abraham that begins in chapter 12, it reads much differently. It's more like history. It follows this consistent timeline, has a different voice than the first 11 chapters. And so what is Genesis 1 through 11? What type of literature is it? We need to define it if we're going to look at it with the proper hermeneutic. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, "The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship from a corkscrew to a cathedral is to know what it is, what it was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used." We need to think of these early chapters as historical myth. Now, Greek mythology from high school English might make you think that myth equals fake, but that's not the meaning here. I say historical myth to clue you in that this is God's history, but told in a way that was meant to be culturally formative stories about all of creation and mankind. They are stories with culturally formative power. These 11 chapters read differently than the rest of Genesis and really could be thought of as the prologue to the entire Bible. And so what's the proper lens or hermeneutic to look at Genesis 1 through 11 with? Well, I'll tell you from the jump that it's most definitely not a scientific lab report. See, we live in a Western society when it comes to our thought processes. We tend to use bullet points, lists, outlines. We express truth using words, ideas, and definitions. We like facts, and faith for us often begins intellectually. If we can't make sense of God, it's hard for us to believe. And so with that framework, we often go to the beginning of the Bible and we try to rationalize God through the text. We try to prove his existence. We try to pull these facts from science that you can look into and read in Genesis as to prove God's existence. This is not at all the proper hermeneutic or lens to approach Genesis with. Genesis was written originally to an audience that had an Eastern perspective of the world. An Eastern perspective expresses truth using word pictures or stories. They prefer poetry, symbols, and imagery compared to our bullet points and lists. Truth is religious and experiential for them, and they assume the existence of God. None of the first readers of Genesis were trying to prove that God existed. They knew he did. They had just witnessed him perform miracle after miracle in Egypt. And so having this understanding will change the way that we read Genesis. We need to realize our Western bias and be open to learning the Eastern way of thinking that the original audience would have had. And with the Eastern and a Western view combined is really when the text will speak the most. Now, I'm not a big music person, okay? I cannot sing, play an instrument. I have zero talent when it comes to that. However, I've been around church long enough to know a little bit at this point. The keyboard, for example. I know that you play with both hands and each hand has a different role. One hand plays the melody, the part of the song that we would all recognize, and the other hand is playing kind of the bass tones, the undertones that played by itself we wouldn't really recognize as a particular song. But without them, the melody would seem real airy and empty. And so both are important. And one is incomplete without the other. And that's what we need to do with the Eastern and the Western perspectives. They each have their own ability to pull things out of Scripture for our understanding. The Western is likely more natural for us to do because that's really the world that we live in. So we maybe need to be more mindful of thinking with the Eastern point of view. But when combined, Scripture really in Genesis 1 through 11 is going to have a lot to offer. And the Eastern view will pull so much out of Genesis for us because it's historical myth. It's not meant to be a scientific lab report of how the world was created. We aren't putting God's existence on trial with the scientific method. Rather, it is full of symbolism, imagery, and poetry that will put us on our knees at the majesty of our Creator God and His inspired word. I really can't wait to jump into it. So the main two concepts I want us to remember from this intro is the setting and the context of Genesis that Moses wrote for the Israelites while they were in the wilderness after their escape from Egypt. And secondly, the Eastern versus Western ways of thinking and approaching Scripture. If we will mix our Western love for facts with the Eastern love for stories and symbols, then it will unlock a whole different side of Genesis for us. I'm excited about that. I hope that you are too. I'll see you next week for Genesis chapter 1. See you then.